When my wife kissed my best friend at my birthday party and called it just drunk, why did I stay silent, lock the door, and let her wake up outside with every bag she owned? Was I protecting my marriage or setting the first trap? My name is Nolan, and I learned on my 36th birthday that a room can be full of people and still feel like a trap you built for yourself. I had spent the whole week telling myself it would be simple, because that was the lie I liked best. A few friends, a few drinks, a cake that leaned slightly to the left because I never cut parchment paper correctly, and the familiar soundtrack of my life playing quietly in the background. Brielle had insisted on hosting, because Brielle always insisted on being the person who made things happen, and Damon had been the first to RSVP, because Damon treated every gathering like it was a stage, and he was allergic to missing a spotlight. I told myself those were harmless traits, the kind you joke about and forgive, the kind you learn to live around, until the moment they become weapons in someone else's hands. The party started the way most disasters start, with ordinary details that later feel like warnings you should have read. The living room smelled like sugar and beer, the kind of messy sweetness that gets into fabric and refuses to leave. Someone had opened the windows, but it only let in the cold edge of night and the faint noise of neighbors living quieter lives. The kitchen counter was crowded with plastic cups that all looked the same, as if anonymity could keep people safe. Brielle moved through it all like she owned the air, laughing too loud, touching shoulders, rearranging plates that did not need rearranging because she loved control more than she loved calm. Damon hovered near her like a satellite that had decided to ignore its orbit, his grin too easy, his eyes too sure, the kind of confidence that assumes everyone else is either impressed or afraid. At first, I played my role. I thanked people for coming. I accepted gifts I did not need. I listened to the same jokes about getting older, as if age were a prank pulled by time and not a slow audit of your choices. I watched Brielle pour drinks for everyone except herself, which should have been suspicious if I had still believed in small warnings, and I watched Damon refill her glass anyway, like he was doing her a favor. He was always good at favors, because favors are the easiest way to buy a debt without asking permission. I noticed the shift before it became obvious, because you always notice what your body is afraid to name. The way Brielle leaned in closer when Damon spoke, the way Damon's hand lingered too long at her lower back when he passed behind her, the way a few guests started glancing at me and then looking away quickly, as if they were checking whether I was still sleeping with my eyes open. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was a party. I told myself I was not the kind of man who polices a room. I told myself a lot of things, because denial is cheap and it comes with free refills. The cake came out and someone turned the lights down like we were filming a commercial for happiness. There were candles, too many candles, because Brielle liked spectacle. People started singing, off-key and earnest, and I felt that strange embarrassment you get when attention is forced onto you and you have to pretend it is a gift. Damon stood close to Brielle, close enough that their shoulders brushed, and I saw the flash of a phone camera near the hallway where the photo booth backdrop hung. Brielle had made that too, a cheap curtain and a ring light, because she loved memories as long as they could be curated. I blew out the candles and the room clapped, and I wished for nothing because I did not trust wishes anymore. That was when it happened, not in a dramatic pause or a sudden crash, but in the messy overlap of people moving, laughing, leaning in to grab plates, leaning in to steal frosting, leaning in because alcohol makes boundaries look optional. Brielle turned toward Damon as if he had said something hilarious, and Damon stepped closer like he had been invited. Their faces met, and for a second it looked like a joke, like a dare, like a stupid moment. Then it didn't look like that anymore, because Brielle's hand lifted and settled on his chest, because Damon's fingers threaded briefly into her hair, because the kiss did not have the sloppy awkwardness of accident, and because the room made that collective sound people make when they want to be entertained and absolved at the same time. It is strange what your mind chooses to save when everything inside you wants to break. I remember the ring light reflecting in a wine glass. I remember a smear of frosting on Damon's knuckle. I remember the way Brielle's eyes were closed, not laughing, not performing, simply enjoying what she was doing. I remember feeling my face go still, like my emotions had stepped out for air. Most of all, I remember the silence that followed, because even the loudest rooms have a limit, and they had reached it. People stared at me, waiting for the familiar script. The husband gets angry, the husband shouts, the husband throws a punch or makes a joke to protect himself. The husband is either a villain or a clown, anything as long as he is predictable. I looked at Brielle and Damon, and I felt something colder than jealousy settle in. Jealousy is noisy. Jealousy demands action. What I felt was calculation, because calculation does not waste energy, and in that moment I understood that wasting energy was exactly what they wanted from me. Brielle pulled back first, laughing too late, her cheeks flushed, her smile bright enough to blind anyone who wanted to keep believing in her. Damon lifted his hands like he was surrendering to a joke, like the kiss had happened to him instead of through him. Someone in the corner laughed, uncertain, and someone else coughed as if their body was trying to return the moment to the world. I said nothing. I let the air thicken. I let everyone feel their own discomfort without rescuing them from it. The party limped forward, because people hate endings that make them responsible. Brielle resumed hosting with that same frantic energy, offering snacks like they were bribes. Damon drifted from group to group, telling stories, flashing that grin, pretending he had not just moved a piece on a board I did not know we were playing. I watched, and I learned. I watched who avoided my eyes, who looked at Brielle with admiration, who looked at Damon with envy. I watched which friends stayed close to me, asking if I was fine without actually wanting the answer. I watched because watching is a kind of control, and control was the only thing I could hold without breaking it. Near the end of the night, when the last guests were collecting coats and the music had become background noise, I finally asked Brielle to come into the kitchen. Damon's laugh carried from the living room, too loud, too confident, as if he already believed the story had ended in his favor. Brielle swayed slightly as she walked, not enough to be helpless, just enough to claim it later if she needed to. Her eyes were sharp, though, and that told me everything I needed to know about how drunk she really was. I demanded she explain what it meant, because I needed to hear how she would frame it when the room was not watching. Brielle rolled her eyes the way she did when she wanted to make someone feel small, and she told me not to be jealous. She said it was just a drunk kiss, and nothing more, the kind of sentence that is supposed to close a door. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like my feelings were an inconvenience she could negotiate away. Damon wandered into the doorway halfway through, leaning against the frame like he belonged there, and Brielle did not tell him to leave. That was the part that hurt the most, because it was not the kiss anymore. It was the alignment, the subtle decision to stand on the same side of the room. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, and not because I believed her, but because I understood something about leverage that night. Words are temporary. Words can be twisted, repeated wrong, carried through group chats like poison. Silence is harder to counterfeit. Silence forces people to fill it with their own fear. Silence makes room for evidence, and evidence is the only language that does not care who tells it. Brielle looked at me as if she was waiting for the explosion, and when it did not come, she smiled with relief, the wrong kind of relief, the kind that belongs to someone who thinks they got away with something. Damon's expression shifted too, just for a moment, a flicker of annoyance that I had not performed for him. Then he recovered, because Damon always recovered, and he clapped me on the shoulder as if we were still brothers, as if the kiss had been a shared joke. After they left the kitchen, I finished cleaning. I threw away paper plates with half-eaten cake. I wiped sticky circles from the table. I stacked cups, rinsed them, placed them upside down to dry, because routine is how you keep your hands from shaking. I did not sleep much. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settling, the quiet creaks that sound like footsteps when you are looking for betrayal in every corner. Somewhere around dawn, I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like gravity. I was not going to beg for respect in my own home. I was not going to argue with a woman who treated humiliation like a party trick. I was not going to fight a best friend who wanted me to swing first so he could call himself a victim. When the morning light finally came, pale and unforgiving, Brielle was not in the bed. I heard the front door rattle once, then stop. I walked downstairs and saw the porch through the small window, and for a moment I thought I was seeing a stranger's life. Brielle was out there in the cold, sitting on one of her own suitcases like it was a throne she had lost. Bags were lined up beside her, neatly arranged, as if someone had taken care to show this was not chaos. It was intentional. Her coat was wrapped tight around her hair messy in the way that makes people look vulnerable, and I knew she would use that look if anyone saw her. She looked up and met my eyes through the glass, and her face shifted from confusion to anger because she understood what had happened. She lifted her hand and knocked once, not pleading, not soft, but sharp, like a demand. I did not open the door. I did not wave. I did not signal anything except the truth she had tried to avoid, that there were consequences, and they were going to be quiet, and they were going to be real. The porch light made Brielle look like a staged photograph. Pale glare above her and darkness behind her. A woman posed between embarrassment and rage, surrounded by luggage like evidence someone had finally stopped negotiating. I stood with my hand on the inside lock, feeling the metal's cold certainty through the wood, and I let my breathing settle before it could turn into anything dramatic. The old version of me would have opened the door just to end the scene, because ending scenes is what peacekeepers do, even when peace costs them. The new version of me was learning that a scene is only power if you participate, and I had decided to starve it. She knocked again, harder, and the sound traveled through the frame into my bones like a demand for permission. I watched her mouth move through the glass, watched her hands lift and fall, watched the performance begin, because Brielle never asked for anything without rehearsing the angle that made her look right. Her eyes kept flicking left toward the street, toward the neighboring homes, toward the windows where early risers lived, and that told me she understood the true risk. She did not fear being outside, she feared being seen outside, because being seen is how the world decides which story is true. I stepped back from the door and moved into the kitchen where the morning light showed every sticky spot I missed, and for a moment I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My birthday had been last night, and the gift I woke up to was a woman outside my house testing the limits of her own audacity. The sink still smelled faintly of frosting and dish soap, and the trash can had that sour party odor that always lingers, as if celebration leaves behind a small rot you cannot scrub away. I poured coffee and watched the steam rise, because steam is honest, and honesty felt rare. The knock came again, but softer now, and I recognized the pivot. Brielle was shifting from anger to vulnerability, because she had mastered the rhythm that makes people doubt themselves. Anger makes you feel justified, vulnerability makes you feel guilty, and guilt is where she did her best work. I carried my mug to the living room and stood where I could see the porch without being seen clearly, because I did not want her reading my face for weakness. She sat up straighter when she thought I might be approaching, then slumped slightly when she realized I was not giving her what she wanted. A movement across the street made my attention sharpen, because the world does not wait for your marriage problems to become convenient. Mrs. Patel's front door opened, and she stepped out with a reusable shopping bag already in her hand, dressed like someone who had been awake long before dawn. She paused the way people pause when they notice something that does not fit the neighborhood's routine, and Brielle turned her head fast, too fast, as if she had been anticipating that exact moment. My wife's posture changed again, shoulders drawing inward, chin lifting just enough to look proud, the perfect mix of wronged and dignified. Mrs. Patel looked from Brielle's luggage to Brielle's face, then toward my house, and I could almost see the question forming. I did not rush to answer it, because rushing would have been a confession of something I had not done. I watched Mrs. Patel hesitate, then continue down the sidewalk, slow and deliberate, a woman collecting information the way some people collect coupons. Brielle followed her with her eyes, and I saw panic there, not about her marriage, but about her image. The phone on the counter buzzed, and the sound cut through my focus with an ugly familiarity. It was the shared line we still pretended made us a team, the same number we used for deliveries and family group texts, the same number she loved because it implied unity. I did not pick it up immediately because immediacy is another kind of surrender, and I had surrendered enough. When it buzzed again, I walked over and looked at the screen, just long enough to see the preview, just long enough to register her name and a cluster of frantic words. I did not open the message. I did not need to. The preview alone told me the headline she was trying to sell. I set the phone face down and waited, letting the house settle into its morning noises, letting the refrigerator hum fill the gaps where arguments used to live. A third buzz came, and I ignored it too. Outside, Brielle stood and started moving the luggage, dragging one bag closer to the steps, as if she might leave, then stopping as if the act of leaving required my permission. She wanted me watching. She wanted me to see her discomfort and feel responsible. She wanted the boundary to blur, because blurred boundaries are where she could rewrite the night as a mutual mistake instead of her choice. I moved through the downstairs rooms like I was inspecting a crime scene, not because I was dramatic, but because I needed to see my life clearly. The party decorations were still up, sagging slightly where tape had loosened, the cheerful paper letters spelling my name like a joke no one found funny anymore. In the hallway, the cheap curtain Brielle used as a photo booth backdrop hung half-skewed, and the ring light stood there like a witness that had seen everything and would say nothing. I imagined the flash, the laughter, the way people leaned into the camera, and I felt my stomach tighten, because the moment of the kiss had not been private. It had been public, and public moments are always chosen. The upstairs was colder, and the bedroom looked wrong without Brielle's familiar clutter. Her side of the dresser was too neat, because I had not touched it, because I did not want to be accused of theft, because I was already anticipating the stories she might tell. I checked the closet and saw that most of her clothing was still there, which meant the luggage on the porch was not an escape plan. It was a message, a staging, a way to force me into a reaction. The bags held enough to look real, enough to make the neighbors believe she had been cast out, but not enough to make her feel at risk. Even in humiliation, she was managing inventory. I returned downstairs and looked at the front door again, and Brielle was standing close to it now, her hand pressed to the glass as if she could push her way through with sheer entitlement. Her mouth moved, her eyes narrowed, and I knew she was shifting back into anger, because vulnerability had not bought her entry. I thought of last night, of her face tilted toward Damon, of her eyes closed, of her hand on his chest. I thought of the second after, the room's silence, the way she laughed too late. I thought of the sentence she had given me in the kitchen, delivered like it should have settled everything, and I felt the last soft part of me harden. I did not open the door. Instead, I stepped into the small entry closet and took out a legal pad and a pen, because paper is where decisions become real. I wrote the date at the top, then the time, then a single line describing what was happening, simple and clean. I wrote that her belongings were on the porch. I wrote that she had access to her phone and coat. I wrote that she was not in danger. I wrote it all as if I might need to show it to someone who did not care about our feelings, because that was the kind of person who mattered now. When I finished, I tore off the page, set it on the console table by the door, and took a photo of it with my own phone, the time visible in the corner of the screen. The act did not make me feel triumphant. It made me feel steady. I had always hated conflict, but I hated chaos more, and documentation was how you take chaos apart piece by piece. Brielle's knocking stopped, and for a moment I thought she had finally left. But then I heard voices outside, muffled through the door, and I recognized Damon's cadence even without the words. That made my blood warm in a way coffee never could, because it confirmed what I suspected. She was not alone. She had called him. She had brought the very man she kissed to my front porch, the same porch she was now treating like a stage. I moved to the window angle again and saw Damon standing a few feet behind her, hands in his pockets, posture loose, like he was waiting for me to entertain him. He looked comfortable, and that was the part that made everything else fall into place. He was not ashamed. He was not worried. He was curious, almost amused, like he was watching an experiment. Brielle turned to him, gesturing sharply, then turned back to the door. Damon leaned closer, said something, and she nodded like he had given her a plan. He glanced up toward the window, and for a second our eyes met through glass and distance, and I saw it there, the expectation. He expected me to come out furious. He expected me to swing first, even if only with words. He expected the story to become about my reaction, not their action. I stayed still, and I let the quiet stretch, because quiet is a mirror, and it forces people to see themselves. Damon shifted his weight after a minute, and his confidence flickered into irritation. Brielle's shoulders tightened and she started pacing, the cold air making her movements sharper. Damon checked his phone, then looked around again, scanning for neighbors, scanning for witnesses, because even people who love attention fear the wrong kind of attention. Mrs. Patel reappeared at the end of the sidewalk, now carrying a small bag of groceries, and she slowed when she saw Damon. Damon gave her a quick smile, the kind he used when he wanted to look harmless, but Mrs. Patel did not smile back. She looked at the luggage again, then at Brielle, then at Damon, and then, without rushing, she walked past as if she had all day to remember the details. I felt something like satisfaction, sharp and controlled, because I understood the first phase had already worked. They wanted a private reset, a closed-door argument, a chance to blur last night into a misunderstanding. I was giving them the opposite: daylight, witnesses, time stamps, and a boundary they could not charm their way through. I took another photo through the window, careful to capture the luggage and the porch light and the shape of Damon in the frame, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. The shared phone buzzed again, and this time I picked it up and opened the message, not to respond, but to read it once and set it aside. Brielle was demanding I stop being childish. She was insisting I let her in so we could talk. She was claiming she had done nothing that mattered. The words were familiar because they were always the same, and that was how I knew she believed them. People like Brielle do not lie the way desperate people lie. They lie the way executives speak, as if reality is something you negotiate. I did not reply. Instead, I walked to the back door and stepped into the small yard, letting the cold hit my face like a reset button. The fence blocked the view of the street, and for a moment, I had privacy, which felt like a luxury. I took a slow breath and listened to the distant noises of the neighborhood waking up, the hum of cars, the faint bark of a dog, the ordinary life continuing without permission. I reminded myself of the constraint I was building. No shouting, no threats, no violence, no games that would stain my hands. I reminded myself that my method was simple, and that simplicity was a blade. When I went back inside, I heard the front porch quiet again, and I knew they had moved away from the door, either to plan, or to save face, or to avoid Mrs. Patel's eyes. I walked toward the living room and noticed something I had missed the first time, because stress narrows your vision. One of Brielle's tote bags, the one she carried everywhere, sat near the hallway where the photo booth was, half unzipped, as if it had been dropped in a hurry last night. That bag should have been with her outside. It was not, and Brielle did not like leaving parts of her life behind. I crouched beside it, not rummaging, not digging, but looking at what was already visible, what had already been left in the open. A folded strip of glossy paper peeked out, the edge catching the light, and my stomach tightened again because I recognized the texture. Photo booth paper has a particular cheap shine, a kind of cheerful plasticity that makes every moment look brighter than it was. I did not pull it out yet. I simply stared at that edge and felt the story shifting under my feet, moving from humiliation into documentation. Outside, Brielle's voice rose briefly, then dropped again, and Damon's laughter answered it, low and confident. I stood up slowly, coffee forgotten, heart steadying into something colder than grief. The party had been last night, but the real event was happening now, in daylight, with a porch full of luggage and a neighborhood full of eyes. I looked at the door, then at the bag, then at the legal pad on the console, and I understood that the kiss was not the worst part. The worst part was that they thought I would beg them to explain it, and that assumption was about to become their first mistake. I stood over Brielle's tote bag like it was a stray animal that had wandered into my house and decided to die on my carpet. It was half unzipped, leaning against the hallway wall near the ridiculous photo booth setup, and the glossy edge of the strip inside it caught the morning light with a cheap optimism that made my stomach turn. I had always hated photo booths, because they pretend a sequence of flashes can turn real life into a harmless joke. But last night had proven that the camera is not what makes a moment cruel. People do that on their own, and the camera simply keeps receipts. Outside, the porch was quiet again, but not in the peaceful way, more like the kind of quiet that happens when a predator is waiting for you to step closer. I could still sense Damon's presence out there, lounging in the cold like he had every right to be on my property, and I could still picture Brielle shifting between anger and victimhood depending on which window she imagined might be watching. The neighborhood was waking up in layers, which meant the audience was growing whether I wanted it or not. I didn't need to open the door to know that my private humiliation was already becoming public entertainment. I knelt beside the tote bag and touched the paper edge with 2 fingers, as if the strip might burn me, because in a way it already had. I pulled it out slowly, not because I was being careful with evidence like a detective in a movie, but because I was stalling the moment when denial dies. The strip unfolded into 4 frames, each one stamped with the venue's logo and the date, each one brightened by the ring light Brielle insisted on, as if light could make everything look clean. The first frame showed Brielle and Damon leaning in too close, smiling like conspirators. The second showed his hand at her waist and her fingers curled at his collar, casual contact that only looks casual when you are lying. The third was the kiss, not the quick peck of a dare, but a deliberate moment where their faces fit together like they had practiced. The fourth frame showed them pulling back and laughing, not embarrassed, not surprised, but pleased. I stared at it long enough for the details to rearrange my memory into something sharper. The room's silence last night had not been confusion. It had been recognition. People had known exactly what they were seeing, and they had been waiting for me to make it safe for them by reacting in a predictable way. I didn't give them that. And now I had proof that my restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategy. I set the strip on the kitchen table and placed my legal pad beside it because I needed my hands doing something useful. I wrote the date again, then the time, then a short line describing what the strip showed, because words on paper have a weight spoken words don't. I photographed the strip next to the legal pad, the clock on the microwave visible in the background, the morning light proving this was not a late-night hallucination. It felt clinical, and that was the point. If I let myself turn this into an emotional scene, I would drown. If I turned it into documentation, I could breathe. The shared phone buzzed again, then again, and I let it buzz until it stopped. I was not going to be trained like a dog to respond to her anxiety. When it finally went quiet, I picked it up and checked the notifications without opening anything that felt like a trap. There were messages from Brielle, one from Damon, and a few from mutual friends who were trying to be neutral without becoming irrelevant. The previews were enough to tell me the angle they were pushing. This was a misunderstanding, this was alcohol, this was a joke, I was being dramatic, I was being childish, I was ruining my own birthday. It was almost impressive how fast a group of adults could build a lie together, the way people pile sandbags against a flood even when they know the water is real. I carried my coffee to the living room window again and watched the porch. Brielle was standing now, arms crossed tight, lips moving as she spoke to Damon, and Damon's posture was relaxed in that irritating way he had always used to suggest he was above consequences. He was the kind of man who could smile through anything because he assumed the world was built to forgive him. Brielle glanced toward Mrs. Patel's house again, then toward the street, and her fear tightened my focus. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of being seen as the kind of woman who gets locked out. That told me where her pain lived, and where my leverage lived too. I didn't open the door, but I didn't hide either. Instead, I walked to the side window that faced the driveway and the sidewalk, the angle that let me see more without giving them a clear shot at my face. Mrs. Patel was in her yard now, moving slowly, trimming something with the patience of a person who had survived decades of other people's nonsense. She looked up once, met my gaze briefly through the glass, then looked away as if she had marked the moment and filed it. I understood her type. She wasn't malicious. She was accurate, and accuracy is terrifying to people who survive on spin. My own phone buzzed, not the shared one, and the notification lit up with the familiar icon of our friends' group chat. The title was something cute and stupid, a joke from years ago when we still believed we were a team. I opened it because it was mine and because public spaces are where evidence hides in plain sight. Someone had posted a blurry photo from the party, the kind taken mid-laugh, mid-movement, a mess of faces and cups and cake plates. Brielle and Damon were in the background, not kissing in that shot, but pressed close, his hand too comfortable on her hip. People had reacted with laughing emojis and teasing comments, and then someone had replied with a quick line about last night being wild, and then, a minute later, the photo was deleted. That deletion didn't erase anything for me, because my phone had already cached the notification preview. I saved the screenshot of the lock screen preview where the image and timestamp still lived, small and undeniable. It wasn't a dramatic smoking gun. It was household level, mundane, and that was why it mattered. People can argue about feelings all day. They struggle to argue with a timestamp. I set the screenshot aside and took another photo of the photo booth strip beside the legal pad. Then I slid both into a clear plastic sleeve from my office drawer, the kind I used for documents that needed to stay clean. I wrote the date on a small label and stuck it to the sleeve. The act felt absurdly normal, like I was preparing paperwork for a client. Except this time, the client was my future, and the opposing party had been sleeping in my bed. Outside, the porch argument escalated. Brielle stepped closer to the door and gestured sharply, as if she was ordering the house to obey her. Damon's head tilted toward the window, and I knew he was scanning for me, trying to locate the weak point in my wall. He wanted a reaction he could narrate later. If I yelled, he would call me unstable. If I came out swinging, he would call me violent. If I begged, he would call me pathetic. Every option fed his story. Silence starved it. I moved through the house and picked up the last scraps of party decor, not because I cared about cleanliness, but because I needed the symbol gone. The cheap banner with my name felt like an insult now, as if the universe had thrown me a surprise party and called it character development. I ripped it down, folded it, and dropped it in the trash. The sound was satisfying in a way it shouldn't have been, because it wasn't revenge, it was closure, and closure always feels like relief when you've been living in denial. When I returned to the kitchen, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a mutual friend who liked Damon and liked Brielle and wanted to keep liking both without consequence. The friend asked if everything was okay, then added a line about how people get silly at parties and how I shouldn't overreact. The word overreact made something sharp in me relax, because it confirmed what I already knew. They weren't worried about my pain. They were worried about my noise. They wanted me quiet because quiet keeps their social circle intact. I did not reply. Instead, I opened my camera roll and created a small folder, nothing dramatic, just a place where the proof could live without being scattered among grocery photos and dog memes. I put the photo booth strip shots in it. I put the lock screen preview screenshot in it. I took a photo of my legal pad page with the date and time and added that too. Then I closed the folder and set the phone down, because I refused to spend my day staring at a screen like a man waiting for permission to feel. The front porch finally went silent, and I heard footsteps move away, first one set, then another. I waited until the sound faded, then checked the side window again. Damon and Brielle were walking down the sidewalk together, not side by side like strangers, but with the easy coordination of people who had already decided they were a unit. They were heading toward Damon's car, and Brielle kept glancing back toward the house as if she expected me to appear in the doorway and shout something theatrical. When I didn't, her posture tightened. She didn't like unanswered scenes. Unanswered scenes make people ask questions, and questions are the one thing she could never fully control. Mrs. Patel watched them go, then turned back to her yard. The morning continued, indifferent. A delivery truck rumbled past. A dog barked twice, then stopped. Somewhere a kid laughed. Life kept moving, and that was the cruel part, because my world had split in half and the neighborhood still needed milk. I decided to leave the house, not to chase them, not to confront them, but to take my own day back. Before I did, I took one last photo through the glass of the porch where the luggage had been, because absence can be evidence too. The bags were gone now, the staging removed, the performance ended. She had wanted a scene with props. She got documentation instead. As I reached for my coat, I noticed something else on the counter, something I had ignored because it seemed harmless. A small, cheap party favor tag with a handwritten note on it, the kind Brielle had made for guests, because she liked curated details. The note was a single line, meant to be cute, and it was signed with a name that wasn't mine. The handwriting was Brielle's, but the sentiment wasn't about me. It was about the night, about the thrill, about being seen. I didn't need to interpret it like a poem. I simply photographed it, because patterns matter, and the smallest artifacts are often the most honest. I left the house through the back door and walked around the fence line to the driveway, stepping into the cold air with my hands in my pockets and my face calm. I knew the neighborhood might still be watching. I knew Brielle might still be performing somewhere. I also knew that for the first time in a long time, I was not chasing her mood. I was building something she couldn't charm her way out of, one small, lawful truth at a time. By the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed again, and this time the notification preview was from Damon. He had sent a message that read like an invitation and a warning at the same time, asking me to talk like men, suggesting we clear the air, implying I was making a bigger deal than necessary. I stared at the preview for a moment, then locked the screen without opening it. I didn't need his explanations. I needed him to understand that the version of me who could be manipulated with ego had expired overnight. I drove away slowly, not because I was cautious, but because I wanted the neighborhood to see something simple. I was not frantic. I was not spiraling. I was not hunting anyone down. I was moving forward, and that's what scares people who expected you to break. At the first red light, I glanced at the photo booth strip again on my phone. The frames lined up like a tiny courtroom exhibit. I felt the ache under my ribs, the part of me that still wanted to believe her, the part that still wanted the easy ending where she apologizes and Damon disappears and the world goes back to normal. I let that part ache without feeding it lies. Then I looked at the timestamp on the lock screen preview screenshot, the mundane proof that reality had an address and a time, and the ache cooled into focus. The kiss was not the entire story, it was the opening move. The real story was what they tried to do afterward, the way they staged luggage, recruited witnesses, pushed narratives, and expected me to provide the explosion that would make them look innocent. I wasn't going to give it to them. I wasn't going to be their proof of victimhood. The light turned green, and I drove on, already aware that when I returned home, Brielle would not be done. She would come back with a new angle, a new mask, a new set of words designed to make me feel like the villain in my own life. I welcomed that, not because I enjoyed conflict, but because every new angle meant another contradiction, and contradictions are where truth starts to bleed through. By the time I pulled into the parking lot at work, my hands were steady. I stepped out of the car and shut the door with controlled force, not slammed, just final. The air smelled like exhaust and cold concrete, ordinary and sharp, and I realized something that surprised me. I was not afraid of what came next. I was only disgusted by how predictable they had been. I walked toward the building entrance, phone in my pocket, evidence folder silent on my device, and I made myself a promise that felt like a verdict. I would not argue about whether the kiss mattered. I would not negotiate with drunken excuses. I would not chase their approval. I would do what I had already started doing, because it was the only thing that worked against people who lived on spin. I would document. I would wait. I would let them hang themselves with their own need to be seen. By lunchtime the next day, the neighborhood had already decided it knew my marriage better than I did, which was impressive, considering most of them still struggled to remember my name without checking a mailbox. I worked through the morning on autopilot, moving papers from one side of my desk to the other, stamping where I needed to stamp, nodding where I needed to nod, and letting the ordinary grind keep my hands steady. The notary counter is a strange place to have a personal collapse, because the whole job is built on other people's certainty, other people's signatures, other people's promises that look clean on paper even when the lives behind them are a mess. I sat there with my own mess folded into a plastic sleeve on my phone, and I could not stop thinking about how easily people swear things are true when they need them to be. The first thing I did that actually mattered was open the HOA email thread on my lunch break, not because I wanted to obsess, but because I knew Brielle's favorite weapon was procedure. She loved systems the way gamblers love tables, because rules make people lazy, and lazy people are easy to steer. Sure enough, there was a fresh notice from the HOA account, written in the polite, bloodless tone that makes every accusation sound like a community service. It mentioned a complaint about late-night noise, then referenced a possible violation around disturbance behavior, and it recommended a review if the pattern continued. The timestamp was from mid-morning, which meant Brielle had either sent it herself or set the machine in motion as soon as she got warm again. I read it twice, not for the content, but for the rhythm. It was too fast, too neat, too aligned with the story she wanted. There had been noise, yes, but it was a birthday party she hosted, and she had never cared about noise when it served her. Now the same noise had become a liability she could pin on me, because my reaction was the only part of the night she could still control from a distance. I forwarded the email to my personal address, then saved a screenshot of the header, because headers are harder to argue with than feelings. When my workday ended, I drove home slow and boring, because boring is how you deny people the satisfaction of watching you unravel. The sun was already dropping, turning the street into that late afternoon gray that makes everything look slightly guilty. My driveway was empty, and the porch was clear, which meant her luggage stunt had been removed like a stage prop once the scene failed. I parked, got out, and stood for a moment with my keys in my hand, letting myself feel the quiet as a fact rather than a threat. Inside, the house smelled like stale cake and cold air. I walked through the entryway and saw the legal pad page still on the console table where I had left it, like a witness that refused to move. I picked it up, read it again, and felt something like grim approval, because it was simple, and it was true, and it did not try to convince anyone of anything. It just existed, which is more than I could say for most of the promises in my marriage. I took my coat off, placed it on the chair, and went straight to the kitchen table where I had laid out the photo booth strip earlier. The strip was still there, but now it looked less like a shock and more like a map. The 4 frames told a complete story without needing my voice, which was useful, because my voice was the one thing everyone expected to twist. I slid the strip into the clear sleeve again and set it beside my phone, then opened the folder I had created and checked the images like I was reviewing exhibits before a hearing. It was not dramatic. It was necessary. Brielle had chosen the kind of betrayal that thrives on ambiguity, so I was building the opposite. My phone buzzed, and the screen lit with a call from Brielle. I watched it ring without answering, because I could already hear the arc in her voice. Outrage first, then tears, then bargaining, then accusations, then the sudden pivot to intimacy, like none of it happened. When it stopped, I waited, and another call came in from Damon, which made me exhale slowly through my nose like a man trying not to laugh at a bad joke. Damon was not calling to apologize. Damon was calling because he thought he could manage me, because he had managed everyone else for years. I let it ring too. A minute later, a message appeared on my phone from a mutual friend who had always loved being close to drama as long as it never touched their own skin. The friend wrote that everyone was worried and that I should just let Brielle inside so we could talk like adults, because adults apparently solve betrayal by turning it into a private conversation and pretending the witnesses do not exist. I did not respond. I set the phone down face up and walked away from it, because I needed to remind myself I was not on call for their comfort. I went upstairs and checked the bedroom again, not to hunt for secrets, but to inventory reality. Brielle's things were still mostly there, and that confirmed what I had suspected all morning. The porch luggage had never been a real move-out. It had been leverage. It had been a way to make me look cruel in front of anyone willing to glance out a window. That meant her next move would not be to leave. It would be to return with an audience, because Brielle believed no conflict mattered unless there were witnesses she could train. I heard a car door slam outside, sharp in the quiet, and then footsteps on the porch. My body reacted before my mind did, a small surge of adrenaline that tried to drag me back into the old script. I stepped to the upstairs window and looked down at the street. Brielle had returned, and she was not alone. Her sister, Paige, was with her, standing close and tense like a guard dog that had been told who to bite. Damon was not there this time, which told me Brielle had adjusted her strategy. If Damon's presence made her look guilty, she would swap him out for family, because family makes everything seem more legitimate. Brielle knocked once, then twice, then started speaking through the door, her voice rising and falling in that practiced way that suggests desperation while still controlling every syllable. Paige joined in, adding weight, adding moral pressure, adding that familiar tone people use when they want to make your boundary sound like abuse. I did not open the door. Instead, I walked downstairs, stood in the hallway where they could not see me clearly, and listened long enough to understand what story they were selling. Brielle was insisting she had been humiliated, insisting she had nowhere to go, insisting I was punishing her over something meaningless. Paige was amplifying it, calling me childish, calling me dramatic, suggesting I was spiraling, as if my refusal to participate in their narrative was evidence of instability. I let the words hit the door and fall to the floor, because that was what they were. They were not attempts to understand me. They were attempts to control what the neighbors might think. I walked into the kitchen, took out my legal pad and wrote the time again, along with a short line describing that she had returned with a family member and was demanding entry. I took a photo of the page with the clock visible, then placed the pad back where it belonged. I did not do it to be cruel. I did it because she was turning our home into a stage, and stages require records if you want the truth to survive. The knocking stopped for a moment, and the silence felt loaded. Then I heard movement to the side, the kind of subtle shift that happens when someone tries a different angle. Paige's voice dropped, and Brielle's voice followed, becoming softer, more intimate, more pleading. They were trying the vulnerability lane again. Brielle talked about how we had built a life together, how I was overreacting, how she needed me to be reasonable. Paige added lines about how marriages have rough nights, how people make mistakes, how I would regret it if I kept escalating. I listened, because listening costs me nothing, and it teaches me where the pressure points are. Then Brielle made a mistake, not a dramatic one, but the kind people make when they forget their own lies. She mentioned that the kiss had been quick and silly, and that Damon had left early, as if that detail would minimize everything. The problem was, Damon had not left early. Damon had been on my porch that morning with her, confident and unashamed, which meant she was trying to rewrite the timeline in a way that fit the drunk mistake story. It was a small contradiction, but small contradictions are where you start building a collapse. I could have opened the door and confronted her right then, asked her to explain that inconsistency, watched her scramble, watched Paige get confused. I did not. I wrote it down instead, a single line on paper, because paper does not argue back, and it does not forget. Then I set the pen down and let them keep talking, because people who lie always talk too much. A few minutes later, I heard a car pull up and another door slam. I moved to the living room window and saw Troy Vance, one of the HOA board members, walking up the sidewalk with a folder under his arm. That sight would have been ridiculous in any normal marriage conflict, but my marriage conflict involved Brielle, and Brielle collected institutions like other people collect souvenirs. Troy paused at the porch steps, looked at Brielle and Paige, then looked at the door, and his face tightened the way it does when someone realizes they have been recruited into something they do not fully understand. Brielle turned to him immediately, gesturing, speaking fast, feeding him the narrative before he could ask his own questions. Troy nodded along, uncomfortable, and then he stepped forward and knocked on the door himself, more politely than Brielle had, because politeness is how people pretend they are neutral, even when they have already chosen a side. He called my name and asked if we could talk, as if this was a scheduling conflict and not a betrayal. I did not open the door, but I did respond, not with emotion, and not with a long explanation. I spoke through the door in a calm voice, short and measured, and I told him I was not available for an unplanned conversation at my doorway. I told him I would respond to any official HOA concerns in writing, and I asked him to email any notices rather than bringing them to my porch. I did not insult him. I did not accuse him. I simply refused the theater. There was a pause outside, the kind of pause that happens when a room's script fails. Troy cleared his throat, and I heard him shift his weight. Brielle's voice rose again, sharper now, and Paige's voice followed. They were angry because I had taken away the only thing they could use, immediacy. They could not force me into a scene if I refused to be present for it. Troy said something to them that I could not fully hear, but the tone changed, and then he spoke toward the door again, asking if I could at least confirm Brielle had access to essentials and was safe. That question was not about her comfort. It was about liability, and it reminded me how quickly personal chaos becomes institutional when someone like Brielle gets involved. I answered, still calm, and I said her belongings were intact, her phone was working, and she was not in danger. I did not elaborate. I did not plead. I simply delivered the fact. Outside, Brielle snapped back, and then her voice dropped again as if she realized she was being witnessed by someone who cared about minutes and rules. Paige murmured something in support, and Troy's discomfort deepened. I could almost see the moment forming in his mind, the moment where he understood he had been brought here as a prop. People hate being props when they are used to feeling important. After another minute, I heard Troy's footsteps move away from the porch, and a car door slam followed soon after. Brielle stayed longer, knocking again, then pacing, then speaking in that softer voice that tries to sound reasonable. I let her. I cooked dinner alone, slow and methodical, because method is how you keep your dignity. I ate at the table where the photo booth strip sat in its sleeve, and I stared at the 4 frames between bites, not because I enjoyed pain, but because I refused to let my mind soften the truth. When the porch finally went quiet and I heard Brielle and Paige leave, the house felt bigger, emptier, and more honest. I washed the dishes, dried my hands, and walked back to the entryway where my legal pad waited like a quiet friend. I added one more line. Troy had come to the porch at Brielle's request. I wrote the time. I took a photo. I set the pad down. Then I checked my email again and saw a new message from the HOA account, polite and sanitized, referencing ongoing concerns and scheduling a review meeting for next week. The phrasing was careful, but the intent was obvious. Brielle was trying to turn my marriage into a compliance issue, because compliance issues have committees, and committees have power. I stared at the email header, and instead of feeling cornered, I felt something settle into place. If she wanted to use the system, then the system would require documentation. If she wanted minutes, then minutes would require facts. If she wanted a public record, then a public record would become the place she lost control. I saved the email, printed it, signed the back with the date, and slid it into the sleeve with the photo booth strip. I went to bed that night alone. But I did not sleep like a defeated man. I slept like a man who had finally stopped asking for permission to be respected. In the dark, I could still feel the sting of the kiss, the insult of her dismissal, the audacity of her porch performance. But under it all was something steadier. Brielle had moved the conflict into a public arena without realizing what that meant for someone like me. Because in public arenas, words are cheap and paper is everything, and I already had the first exhibit. The next week moved like a slow grindstone, not dramatic, not cinematic, just steady pressure that wore down whatever soft illusions I still had left. Brielle stopped trying to storm the front door after the night she brought Paige, but she did not stop trying to enter my life through other openings, and that was the part people never understand about control. Control does not need your permission. It only needs access to a system you forgot to guard. In Brielle's case, the system was the neighborhood itself, the HOA channels, the mutual friend network that treated truth like a suggestion, and the small daily logistics that used to feel harmless when we were still pretending we were on the same team. I kept my routines boring on purpose. I went to work, I came home, I cooked, I slept, and I did not chase her moods. If someone had looked at my calendar from the outside, they would have assumed nothing was wrong, and that was exactly what I wanted. People like Brielle thrive on reaction, and Damon thrived on spectacle even more than she did. If I stayed predictable, they had nothing to dramatize, and if they had nothing to dramatize, they had to invent, which meant they had to create contradictions, and contradictions were the oxygen of my method. The HOA meeting notice sat in my inbox like a threat wrapped in etiquette. It was written in that bland language that makes cruelty look like procedure, and it referenced concerns that were vague enough to be flexible. Vague concerns are the most useful kind when you want to pressure someone without leaving fingerprints, because you can widen them later. I printed the notice, stapled it to the other pages in my growing sleeve stack, and wrote the date on the back. The stack was still thin, but it was clean, and clean evidence is the only kind that survives a room full of people eager to protect their comfort. The first new proof landed in the most ordinary way possible, which is how it always happens when people make mistakes while feeling entitled. Midweek, around the time normal couples would be texting each other about groceries or dinner plans, my phone flashed a merchant alert tied to an account I owned. It was not a massive charge that screamed scandal. It was a normal charge amount, the kind that could be explained away with a shrug, and that was what made it dangerous. Brielle had built her whole defense on the idea that last night was meaningless, that everything ended with a drunk kiss, that nothing followed. This alert suggested something followed, something that cost money, something that had a time and a place attached to it. I didn't assume what it meant. Assumptions are a trap because they give your enemy a way to call you unstable. I opened the banking app and stared at the line item until the details settled into focus. It was a late-night purchase at a place near the venue, a location I recognized from the area's cluster of bars and small restaurants. The timestamp sat there like a pin in a map. Brielle's cover story had already tried to compress the night into a single moment. Timestamps stretch moments back out into reality. I took a screenshot of the transaction line, making sure the date and time were visible, then I saved it into my evidence folder. I did not feel triumphant. I felt calm in the way you feel when you find a missing bolt and realize why the machine has been rattling. It was not the kiss alone that mattered now. It was the pattern of choices around it, the way a night becomes a chain if you follow the links. The problem with financial proof is that people love to argue that money does not equal meaning. They will tell you anyone can buy anything, that a charge could be for a friend, that it could be a mistake, that you are reading too much into it. They will say anything as long as it gives them room to breathe. I didn't need to win an argument in my kitchen. I needed confirmation from someone neutral, someone who did not care about my marriage, someone who cared about the simple truth of time. So I drove to the place listed on the transaction, not like a detective on a mission, but like a tired man running an errand. The building looked ordinary. Neon sign, small patio, the kind of place where people go to feel anonymous in a crowd. I went inside, ordered something small, and waited until the cashier had a quiet moment. I asked in simple language whether they could look up a receipt by date and time if I had a transaction and needed to confirm it for my own records. I did not mention a wife, a party, a kiss, or a friend. I did not need sympathy. I needed a fact. The cashier agreed in that bored, practical way people have when they are used to small requests. They pulled up the time window and confirmed that the receipt existed at that exact time, and they verified that the payment method matched mine. They did not tell me who was holding the card, because they shouldn't, and I didn't ask because I didn't need a confession in a stranger's voice. I needed one piece, the POS time match. The cashier printed a copy of the receipt and handed it over like it was nothing, because to them it was nothing, and that was why it mattered to me. I took the receipt to my car, placed it on the passenger seat, and stared at it for a minute before doing anything else. The paper was cheap, the ink slightly faded, the kind of flimsy document that normally ends up crushed at the bottom of a trash bin. In my world now, that flimsy paper was a lever. It was a secondary corroboration that tied the bank line to a physical transaction at a physical place at a physical time. It did not prove love. It did not prove sex. It did not need to. It proved the night extended past the kiss, and it proved that someone used my resources to do it. Back at home, I photographed the receipt beside the day's newspaper, not because I enjoyed the ritual, but because date anchoring matters when people start telling stories. Then I slid the receipt into a sleeve, labeled it, and added it to the stack. My evidence ledger was no longer just an ugly little photo booth strip. It was becoming a table of small truths, each one boring on its own, but together they formed a picture people could not ignore without admitting they were choosing blindness. Brielle texted me later that evening, and the preview on the shared line tried the reasonable tone again. She said she wanted to talk before the HOA meeting, because she was worried about how it would look, because she was worried about our reputation, because she was worried I would embarrass her. She did not mention my feelings. She did not mention Damon. She did not mention accountability. She wanted to manage optics, and the fact she said it in writing almost made me smile. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my legal pad and wrote down the time her message arrived, then summarized it in one neutral sentence. Then I set the pen down and made myself dinner. The food tasted like nothing, but I ate anyway. Stability is not something you feel, it is something you do. The next pressure came from the friend circle, right on schedule, because social systems hate unresolved tension. 2 mutual friends invited me to coffee, phrasing it like concern, but the timing was too neat. They wanted to check on me before the HOA meeting, which meant they wanted to calibrate what I might do in public. When I met them, they sat across from me with that cautious energy people have when they are about to ask you to be smaller for their comfort. They implied Brielle was struggling. They implied I was being harsh. They implied a drunk kiss was not worth burning down friendships. They implied a lot of things, and I listened without taking the bait. I asked calmly whether they had seen the kiss themselves. One of them admitted they had. I asked whether they thought it looked like a joke. Neither of them answered cleanly. Then I asked whether Damon had apologized to me privately. They both shifted their eyes because that was the question that tore their neutrality in half. They tried to soften it by saying Damon had been drinking too, as if alcohol was a priest who could absolve anyone willing to blame it. I nodded, not agreeing, just acknowledging the words existed. Then I told them I was not discussing private marriage matters in a cafe, and I changed the subject to something mundane until the meeting ended awkwardly. When I got home, I wrote down the interaction as a single line. Friends attempted to pressure reconciliation for optics. I did not include emotion. Emotion is what people argue about. Fact is what they trip over. The HOA meeting crept closer, and the neighborhood's posture changed as the date approached. People in the lobby greeted me differently, lingering a half-second longer on my face, as if searching for cracks. The mailroom felt louder, because whispered conversations are louder than normal ones. Even the way a neighbor held the door shifted from friendly to cautious, as if my marriage had become contagious. I noticed every detail because my mind was forcing me to, and because details are how you survive when your home becomes a public object. Mrs. Patel remained the one consistent, neutral element, not in the sense that she supported me, but in the sense that she supported reality. One evening, she was watering plants near the sidewalk as I returned from work, and she looked up and asked, in a practical tone, whether everything was settled after the morning she saw the luggage. She did not sound curious. She sounded like a person confirming what she would later remember. I kept my answer simple. I said there had been a disagreement and that I was handling it. I did not give her gossip to spread. I gave her a calm baseline that contradicted the unstable husband story Brielle was trying to build. Mrs. Patel nodded, then mentioned she had seen Damon at my porch that morning too, and her tone implied she found it strange. That small detail landed like a weight. It meant my memory was not the only memory. It meant the neighborhood had a witness who did not owe Brielle anything. I went inside and wrote it down immediately, not as a dramatic statement, but as a neutral witness line. Neighbor observed Damon present at porch the morning after party. I recorded it as a single-sentence summary, because the purpose was not to recruit her. The purpose was to show that Brielle's quick, silly mistake narrative had already been witnessed as something more coordinated. The night before the HOA meeting, I prepared the evidence the way I prepared documents for any official situation. Simple, clear, minimal, and impossible to misunderstand. I did not bring a novel. I did not bring a speech. I built a one-page timeline table with dates, times, and locations. I attached 3 items behind it: the photo booth, strip photos, the bank alert screenshot, and the printed receipt copy with the timestamp visible. I added the HOA email header that had arrived suspiciously fast. Then I placed each set into a clear sleeve, labeled, with the date written neatly. I wasn't trying to overwhelm anyone. Overwhelm is how you look obsessive. I was trying to create a clean line from event to pattern to misuse of procedure. Brielle's power was not physical. It was structural. It was her ability to turn a room into a verdict with a smile. The only way to beat that was to remove the room's ability to pretend it didn't know. At midnight, my phone buzzed again, and the preview showed Damon trying a new angle. He wanted to clear things up. He wanted me to stop making it a bigger deal. He wanted to meet privately. The message was careful, polite, and insulting in its own way, because it assumed I was only angry, not strategic. It assumed I could be calmed down like a dog with a treat. I locked the phone without opening it. Damon wanted a private conversation because private conversations are where charm works. I had no interest in charm. I was building record. I slept in short fragments, waking to the quiet of the house and the small buzz of anxiety under my skin. By morning, I was awake before my alarm, sitting at the kitchen table with the sleeves stacked neatly beside my coffee. The house was still, but my mind was moving in straight lines now. I wasn't going into that meeting to shame Brielle, because shame is an emotion, and emotion can be dismissed. I was going into that meeting to remove her leverage and to protect my next 30 days, because realism mattered. The consequences had to be civil and social and professional. They had to fit the world we lived in. They had to land without violence and without fantasy. When I left for the clubhouse, I carried the evidence in a plain folder, no binder, no theatrics. The air outside was cold, and the sky had that flat gray tone that makes everyone look guilty. As I walked across the courtyard, I saw a few neighbors glance at the folder and then glance away quickly, and I felt the smallest flicker of satisfaction. They weren't curious about me. They were afraid of being wrong. At the clubhouse door, I paused and took one breath, slow and measured, as if I was stepping into a professional appointment rather than a public dissection of my life. I reminded myself of the rules I had set. No shouting, no insults, no threats, no pleading. Just documents, just dates, just silence where silence did the most damage. Inside, the hallway smelled like cheap cleaner and old carpet. I could already hear voices in the meeting room, the low hum of people preparing to decide what kind of story they wanted to live with. Brielle would be in there, polished and controlled, ready to paint me as jealous and unstable. Damon might even appear, smiling, ready to act like a victim of my overreaction. Either way, it didn't matter, because I wasn't bringing anger into that room. I was bringing timestamps. The meeting room in the clubhouse looked like every other community room that pretends it is neutral while quietly deciding who gets to belong. Folding chairs, a long table, a pot of coffee that always tasted like plastic, and a bulletin board covered in cheerful flyers that read like propaganda for people who needed to believe their neighborhood was a family. I walked in with my plain folder under my arm, and my face set in the kind of calm that makes nervous people angry, because calm refuses to play along with their fear. A few heads turned, then turned away, then turned back, as if they were checking whether I looked like the unstable husband they had been warned about. I let them look. I let them measure me. The point was not to win their hearts. The point was to deny them the excuse they came prepared to use. Brielle was already there, seated near the front, posture perfect, hair smoothed into place like she had been planning this as carefully as she planned everything else. She wore the kind of outfit that signals competence without warmth, a uniform for a woman who loved power but hated being called power-hungry. Troy sat a few seats away, his expression tense, and I recognized the discomfort of a man who realized too late that being on a board meant being dragged into other people's private wars. 2 other board members were present, faces tight with polite restraint, and a handful of neighbors had come as audience, the way people come to court hearings when they want to feel important without taking risk. Kendra Miles sat at the long table with a laptop open and a small stack of papers beside it, and she looked like the only person in the room who was truly comfortable. She was not comfortable because she enjoyed conflict. She was comfortable because she trusted procedure more than people. Kendra had the kind of face that made you think of stamps, forms, and cleanly labeled folders. I had noticed her before in passing, always present at meetings, always listening, always typing, and I had never cared because my life had not been a public record. Now my life was about to become a public record, and the quiet person with the minutes was suddenly the most important witness in the room. I took a seat near the back, not hiding, just choosing a position that gave me a clear view of the table and the exits. My folder stayed on my lap like a weight, and I kept my hands still so nobody could claim they were shaking. The air smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee, and the fluorescent lights made everyone's skin look slightly sick, which felt fitting. This wasn't a place where anyone got to look good. This was a place where they got to be documented. Kendra called the meeting to order in a tone that suggested she did not care who hated whom, and that she was willing to wait out any performance until it ran out of oxygen. She reviewed the agenda in a neutral voice, and I watched Brielle's eyes flick briefly toward the neighbors, as if she was checking her audience. Brielle's instinct was always to manage the room, to steer the mood before the facts arrived, and I saw her preparing to do it again. When the topic turned to ongoing concerns, the phrase floated in the air like a weapon disguised as a pillow. Brielle leaned forward slightly, and her expression softened into concern, the mask she used when she wanted to look like a caregiver instead of a controller. She began summarizing the situation in careful language that framed her as reasonable and me as unpredictable, and even though she avoided specific accusations, the shape of it was unmistakable. She referenced a loud party, referenced a domestic disturbance implication without saying the words outright, referenced community discomfort, referenced the need to ensure safety. It was an elegant smear, the kind that never calls you a monster but makes everyone wonder if you are one. I listened without moving because I had already learned that interrupting is how you give someone power. Brielle could talk. Let her. The more she talked, the more she committed to a story. The more she committed, the easier it would be to show the seams. As she spoke, I looked around the room and watched the audience react. Some nodded as if they had already heard this version. Some looked uncertain because they had seen her on my porch and did not know how to reconcile that with the image of her as victim. One neighbor kept glancing at Kendra's laptop as if the minutes themselves were the real authority. They weren't wrong. In places like this, minutes are truth, not because they are always accurate, but because they become the official memory everyone pretends they did not shape. When Brielle finished, she sat back with a small sigh, like she had carried a burden for the community. Troy glanced down, then back up, avoiding my eyes. One of the other board members cleared their throat, murmured something about de-escalation, and then looked to Kendra for direction, because nobody in that room wanted to lead a public conflict they did not fully understand. Kendra's fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to record whatever came next, and I felt a strange satisfaction at the thought that Brielle had finally moved her manipulation into a space where it could be recorded against her. Kendra asked whether I wanted to respond, and the room's attention tightened like a wire. This was the moment they wanted, the moment where I would either lash out and confirm Brielle's narrative, or plead and look weak, or apologize for something I had not done. I stood slowly, not abrupt, not aggressive, and I kept my voice steady. I said I would respond in writing if needed, but that I did have documented clarifications to submit to the board's record. I used simple words, because complex words sound like strategy, and I did not want them thinking I was trying to outsmart them. I wanted them thinking I was simply refusing to be lied about. I walked to the table and placed a single clear sleeve in front of Kendra, not a stack, not a binder, just one packet. The top page was my one-page timeline table, clean and simple, showing the date of the party, the time range, and the key points that were relevant to the HOA's stated concerns: noise, timing, and the rapid arrival of the notice. Behind it were 3 attachments, neatly labeled. I did not slide them around the table. I did not wave them in the air. I simply placed them down, then stepped back, letting Kendra be the one to touch and view them. That mattered, because people trust a neutral administrator more than a spouse in pain. Kendra examined the top page, then glanced at the attachments. Her expression stayed neutral, but her eyes sharpened the way they do when someone sees a contradiction they cannot ignore. She asked to verify whether the documents were being submitted for the record, and I confirmed that they were. She nodded once and began typing, and the sound of her keys was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. Brielle's posture tightened. Her eyes flicked to the sleeve, then to Kendra's face, then to mine. She forced a smile that looked like it hurt. I could almost hear her recalculating, searching for a way to keep control without appearing controlling. When you bring documents into a room like this, you change the rules, because documents don't care how charming you are. Kendra asked to see the first attachment, and I nodded. She slid the page out carefully, and I watched the room lean forward slightly, the way people lean forward when they sense blood but want to pretend they are still polite. The photo booth strip images were not graphic, not scandalous, just 4 bright frames that made one thing obvious. Brielle and Damon's closeness did not look like a random accident. It looked like familiarity. It looked like choice. Brielle tried to speak again, and Kendra held up a hand, not rude, just procedural, the gesture of someone reminding a room that there is an order. Kendra read out the date stamp on the strip and noted it for the minutes. She then moved to the next attachment, the bank alert screenshot, and confirmed the timestamp aloud in her neutral voice, as if she was reading a grocery list. The room shifted again, because numbers do something to people that emotion cannot. Numbers feel like math, and math feels like truth, even when people resent it. I could see the confusion spreading through the neighbors' faces, not because they suddenly cared about my marriage, but because they cared about the shape of the narrative they had accepted. Brielle had framed me as volatile, as noisy, as the source of disturbance. The document suggested a different story, one where she had been the one staging and pressuring, and where she was willing to use community channels to punish me for refusing to perform. Kendra looked at the third attachment, the receipt copy with the POS time printed, and she asked, still neutral, whether it had been obtained lawfully. I confirmed it had been requested as a personal record for an account I owned, without mentioning any private identities. Kendra nodded, satisfied, and typed again. That typing mattered more than any argument Brielle could make, because it turned my claim into a recorded fact. I had documentation that contradicted the nothing happened story and suggested a pattern of behavior after the party. Brielle finally found a lane that felt safe, and she used it. She pivoted to morality, to marriage, to private conflict, insisting the HOA was not the place for personal issues. She said the board should not be forced to look at marital drama. She said I was humiliating her. She said I was escalating. The words were familiar, and they landed in the room exactly the way she hoped. Some people winced, some looked away, some nodded, because people love the idea that conflict is impolite and should be hidden. She was trying to turn my evidence into bad manners. I did not respond with anger. I responded by doing less. I told the board I agreed the HOA was not a marriage counselor, and that I had not asked the HOA to become one. I reminded them calmly that an HOA notice had been sent under their authority, and I was responding to that notice with clarifications that addressed their stated concerns. I did not say Brielle had weaponized her role. I did not accuse her of misconduct. I did not need to. The documents did that work by implying the timeline did not make sense unless someone had pushed it. Troy finally spoke, hesitant, and asked whether the notice had been initiated through the standard complaint process. His question was cautious, and it was also a crack, because cracks are where rooms start to fracture. Brielle answered too quickly, and in doing so, she stepped into the trap she had built for herself. She referenced the need to act fast because people were worried, and she glanced toward the audience as if hoping someone would validate her. Nobody did. People looked at their laps, their hands, the coffee pot, anything but her eyes. Kendra asked for the complaint reference number, the procedural detail that either exists or does not. Brielle hesitated, then tried to deflect by talking about community feelings again. Kendra waited, fingers poised over the keyboard. The silence stretched. Brielle hated silence because silence cannot be managed, and I watched her throat tighten as she realized she might not have a clean answer. That was when the first major twist began to reveal itself, not as a theatrical unveiling, but as a pattern snapping into place. Brielle was not simply covering for a drunk kiss. She was trying to create an official-looking trail that framed me as unstable, because an unstable husband is easier to control in mediation, easier to pressure in property division, easier to isolate socially. The kiss at the party had not just been a betrayal, it had been a spark, a deliberate moment staged in public so she could predict the fallout and steer it. She expected me to explode. When I didn't, she had to manufacture a different kind of explosion on paper. I did not announce this realization to the room because announcing it would have made it look like speculation. Instead, I let Kendra's procedural questions do the cutting. Kendra asked again for the complaint details, and Troy shifted in his seat, suddenly more interested in the mechanics than the emotions. One of the neighbors cleared their throat, uncomfortable, because they realized they had been recruited into a story without consent. Brielle's mask slipped for a second, just a second, and the irritation showed, sharp and ugly. Then she recovered and tried to smile again, but the smile did not reach her eyes. She was losing control of the room, not because I had attacked her, but because the system she loved had rules that required specificity. Rules are wonderful tools until they demand you be consistent. Kendra typed something, then looked up and stated, in the same neutral tone, that the board would need to review the submission and verify the complaint process before taking any action. She said it like a formality, but I felt the consequence land anyway. Verification meant Brielle could not simply decree outcomes. Verification meant someone else would touch the record. Verification meant minutes would reflect uncertainty rather than Brielle's preferred verdict. The meeting ended without fireworks, which was exactly what I wanted. Brielle looked furious, and fury in a room like this is always a confession. As people stood and began folding chairs back into place, neighbors avoided Brielle's eyes, then glanced at me with a new kind of caution, the kind reserved for men who don't shout but still win. Troy lingered near the door, pretending to check his phone, and I could tell he wanted to ask questions without admitting he had been manipulated. He didn't ask them. Not yet. Brielle moved toward me with that rigid energy that meant she was about to try one more private confrontation, one more attempt to drag me back into a personal argument where she could weaponize emotion. I didn't give her the chance. I picked up my folder, nodded politely to Kendra, and walked out first, leaving the room before Brielle could reclaim it with a performance. In the hallway, the air felt cooler, and the sound of voices behind me became muffled, less powerful. I stepped outside into the gray afternoon and felt the smallest release in my chest. The board had not punished her. The board had not saved me. The board had done something more valuable. It had hesitated. Hesitation is what happens when a room realizes the story it accepted might be wrong. As I walked back toward my townhome, I heard the clubhouse door open behind me and footsteps following, faster than mine. I didn't turn around immediately, because turning would have been an invitation. I kept walking, steady and deliberate, letting whoever followed decide how desperate they wanted to look. When I finally glanced back, it was Troy, not Brielle. His expression was tight, and he held his folder like a shield. He asked if we could speak briefly, and his voice had the careful tone of a man trying to avoid taking sides while still needing answers. I told him, calmly, that I would respond to any HOA questions in writing, because writing protects everyone from misremembering. He nodded, frustrated but not offended, and he said he would email. I continued walking, and behind me I heard Brielle's voice in the distance, sharp and angry, aimed at Troy now, not at me. That sound followed me like a reminder. When you refuse to be the target, the weapon turns inward. Back at my house, I set the folder on the kitchen table and sat down slowly, feeling the adrenaline drain from my limbs. My hands were still steady, and that was how I knew I had done the right thing. I opened my legal pad and wrote a single line about the meeting outcome. Board requested verification of complaint process, action deferred. I wrote the time. I took a photo. Then I closed the pad and stared at the wall for a long moment, letting the quiet be real. The twist was no longer a suspicion in my gut. It was a structure I could see clearly. Brielle had not just betrayed me with Damon. She had tried to turn my reaction into her shield, and when I refused, she had turned to paperwork, to procedure, to social pressure, to any system that could be made to look official. She wanted me framed as unstable so she could keep control of the narrative and, eventually, control of the outcome. I wasn't going to fight her with shouting. I was going to fight her with 1,000 small truths, each one stamped with a time and a place, until her story collapsed under its own weight. The HOA meeting should have been the end of that particular circus, because most people lose interest once the minutes start looking like liability, but Brielle never loved a stage more than she loved a system. Systems give her two things she craves: an audience that feels obligated to listen, and a paper trail she can point at later, like it was fate instead of her hand. I walked home from the clubhouse with my folder tucked under my arm, and a strange kind of quiet inside me, because for the first time since the kiss, I could see the shape of her plan without guessing. She had wanted me to explode in public, and when I didn't, she tried to manufacture an explosion in procedure. That realization didn't make me feel strong. It made me feel tired in a clean way, the way you feel when you realize the problem isn't complicated. It's just relentless. Brielle wasn't confused. Brielle was committed. When I got inside, I didn't celebrate, because celebration invites arrogance, and arrogance invites mistakes. I did what I'd been doing all week, which was the only thing that kept my head above water. I wrote the time of my return on my legal pad, noted that Troy asked for written follow-up, and photographed the line with the kitchen clock visible. Then I slid the meeting packet back into its sleeve and placed it in the same drawer as the rest, because evidence is useless if you treat it like a trophy. The first thing Brielle did after the meeting was try to reclaim the narrative through people who still answered her calls. That evening, the group chat lit up with new messages, not about concern for me, but about how uncomfortable everything had become. The language was always careful, always indirect, which is how people disguise cowardice as kindness. They asked if we could all stop involving the community. They suggested I was taking it too far. They reminded me Brielle had been drinking. They used the word mistake like it was a magic eraser. I watched the thread for a minute, then I set the phone down. Not because I was above it, but because I knew where it led. Group chats are where truth goes to get softened by committee. If I argued, they would remember my tone instead of Brielle's actions. If I stayed silent, they would have to live with the discomfort of their own complicity, and discomfort is a better teacher than my anger. At 9:30, a new notification appeared on my own phone, one of those half-formed flashes that only gives you a sentence before it disappears. It was from Paige, sent to the shared line, and I saw the preview without opening it. She was demanding I let Brielle collect the rest of her things, and she was implying that if I refused, certain calls would be made. That wording was familiar. It wasn't a request. It was a threat, dressed as logistics. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned on the porch light from inside and checked my doorbell camera feed, not because I was paranoid, but because paranoia is when you invent dangers, and I was dealing with real ones. The camera faced my own front steps, a narrow angle that captured more timestamps than faces, and that was fine. I wasn't trying to make a movie. I was trying to make a record. At 10:05, headlights swept across the street, slow and deliberate, and a car rolled up near my curb like it was trying not to be noticed. The camera caught it in fragments. The reflection on the driveway, the brief silhouette at the edge of frame, the small pause before someone stepped onto my porch. Brielle appeared a second later, coat pulled tight, hair pinned back like she wanted to look serious. Paige followed behind her, and then another figure entered the edge of frame and stopped near the walkway, not walking up fully, staying just out of view like someone who knew what a camera could do. That third figure didn't need to show his face for me to recognize the posture. Damon's confidence had a particular laziness to it. The way he always stood like gravity was optional. He was there, close enough to be part of the scene, far enough to deny it if needed. Brielle and Paige moved toward the door, and I watched the timestamp tick in the corner of the feed like a metronome. The knock came, hard and short, and I stayed seated at my kitchen table where the light was warm and the air was still. I let them knock again. I let Paige's voice rise through the door, then drop, then rise again, testing different tones like she was spinning a lock. I didn't answer with words. I answered by not opening the door. Brielle tried the softer lane. She spoke in the measured way she used when she wanted to sound reasonable to an unseen audience. She framed it as her needing access to personal items, as me withholding, as me escalating. She was building a story right there on my porch, knowing the camera would capture my silence but not my face. That was fine. Silence wasn't guilt. Silence was boundary. After a few minutes, Paige's voice sharpened, and the phrasing changed. She mentioned my job, then mentioned reputation, then mentioned the word complaint as if she was tasting it. I felt my jaw tighten, not from fear, but from recognition. Brielle had moved from social pressure to institutional pressure, which meant she was losing patience, which meant she would start making sloppier choices. I picked up my phone and saved a still frame from the doorbell feed, the one where Brielle and Paige stood on the steps, and Damon's shape hovered just outside the edge, like a shadow trying to stay innocent. The still included the timestamp, the porch light, and the angle of the street, enough to anchor the moment without turning it into a spectacle. Then I saved it into the folder and wrote a single line on my legal pad. Late-night retrieval attempt with family present, third party waiting near walkway. I dated it, timed it, and photographed the page. They left after 13 minutes, not because they were done, but because they realized they were performing into a void. The car pulled away slowly, and the porch light fell back into quiet. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant noise of someone else's television through a neighbor's wall. It was absurd how normal the house sounded while my life was being dismantled on the outside. The next morning, the institutional pressure arrived exactly the way Paige hinted it would. I received an email from the State Notary Commissioning Office, the kind of bland government address you only notice when it shows up with your name in the subject line. It was a notice of inquiry, short and procedural, stating a complaint had been received about professional conduct and requesting a response within 5 business days. No details, no accusations spelled out, just the phrase "complaint received" and the implied threat that the machine could start turning without caring who deserved it. I stared at the email header and felt my pulse slow instead of spike, because fear is what Brielle wanted, and I refused to give her that even in private. People who weaponize systems rely on your panic, because panic makes you sloppy. Sloppy people contradict themselves. Contradictions are what investigators remember. I printed the email, wrote the date on the back, and slid it into a sleeve. Then I opened my evidence folder and pulled up the doorbell still frame from last night, because the timing mattered. If she had filed a complaint, she did it after the HOA meeting, after her story failed in public, after she came to my porch at night with Damon lurking nearby. The complaint was not about ethics, it was about control. At work, I kept my face neutral and my movement steady. I did not tell coworkers. I did not ask for favors. I did not complain to anyone who could later become a witness with opinions. I simply did my job and let the day move, because I knew my response would have to be clean, short, and backed by documentation, not emotion. By the time I got home, there was another message from Brielle on the shared line, and the preview alone made the pattern obvious. She wanted to talk like adults and avoid misunderstandings before I made things worse. The sentence was designed to sound like concern while implying I was the one creating harm. She always did that. She always spoke as if my boundaries were attacks. I sat at my kitchen table and drafted my response to the inquiry on paper first, because paper forces you to stay precise. I stated that I had received the notice. I stated I would cooperate fully. I requested the specific allegation in writing. I stated calmly that I believed the complaint was retaliatory and connected to an ongoing domestic dispute, and I offered to provide time-stamped documentation of harassment attempts if the office required context. I did not accuse Brielle of lying. I did not describe the kiss. I did not mention Damon's name. I kept it clean. I am requesting details, I will respond, and I have documentation of retaliation if relevant. Then I signed the draft, dated it, photographed it, and typed it into an email. I attached nothing yet. Attachments are ammunition, and you don't fire without a target. I sent the email and saved the sent copy in a folder because sent emails have headers, and headers are truth's best friend. That should have been enough for one day, but Brielle wasn't done. That evening, my phone lit up again with a new notification from the group chat. Someone had posted a photo of Brielle sitting at Paige's kitchen table, eyes red, makeup smudged just enough to look authentic, a mug of tea in her hands like a prop. The caption implied she had been locked out and abandoned. The sympathy rolled in immediately, because people love comforting a pretty story more than they love checking facts. The post was deleted within minutes, but I had already seen the preview. I saved the lock screen preview screenshot with the timestamp visible, not because it proved the photo was staged, but because it proved she was broadcasting the narrative in real time while simultaneously pressuring institutions to punish me. That's what made it retaliatory. Not the tears, the coordination. Later that night, Mrs. Patel knocked on my door once, soft and careful, as if she understood a loud knock might become part of the neighborhood's mythology. When I opened the door, she didn't step inside. She simply handed me a piece of mail that had landed in her box by mistake, then paused and looked at me with the same practical expression she always wore. She mentioned casually that she saw Brielle's car parked down the street last night, and she mentioned even more casually that Damon's car was behind it. She didn't say she was accusing anyone. She said it the way you mention the weather, because facts don't need dramatic delivery. I thanked her and didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't need her to become a witness with an agenda. I needed her to remain exactly what she was, a neutral observer who could not be bullied into changing what she saw. After she left, I wrote a single line on my legal pad. Neighbor observed 2 vehicles aligned late night, consistent with doorbell timestamp. I dated it and photographed it, because corroboration is how you turn a suspicion into a structure. When I finally sat down to eat, my appetite was gone, but I forced myself through a meal anyway, because discipline is the only thing that keeps you from becoming your enemy's caricature. Brielle wanted me sleepless, frantic, and reactive. Damon wanted me angry and loud, because anger makes you easy to frame. I wasn't going to give them either. I finished cleaning, set the evidence sleeves back in their drawer, and stood in my hallway for a long moment, listening to the house's quiet. There was an ugly clarity settling in, the kind that doesn't feel like healing but still moves you forward. The kiss at my birthday party had been the spark, but the real fire was what followed. The staged luggage, the porch performances, the HOA pressure, the professional complaint, the social media theater, all aimed at one outcome. They didn't want forgiveness. They wanted control of the record. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, my phone buzzed one more time. This time, it was an email notification from the notary office again, and the subject line was different. It said the complaint had been assigned an intake number and that further details would follow. I stared at the words until they stopped looking like a threat and started looking like an opportunity. Because intake numbers are time-stamped, and timestamps are my favorite language. I went to bed with the intake email saved, the still frame stored, and the group chat preview captured, and I felt the next move forming in my mind with cold certainty. If Brielle wanted to drag my reputation into official channels, then those channels would require specificity, and specificity would force her to commit to lies she could not keep straight. The only question left was how far she was willing to go before she realized every new pressure point she pulled was also another thread I could document, label, and pull back just as hard. The details of the complaint arrived 2 days later, and they were exactly what I expected from a woman who treated paperwork like a weapon, vague enough to stain, specific enough to scare, and phrased in a way that made the reader imagine the worst without ever saying it outright. The email from the commissioning office included an intake summary, a reference number, and a short list of allegations that read like a stranger trying to describe a storm through a window. It claimed I had behaved unprofessionally in a domestic matter, that I had used my position to intimidate, and that I had misrepresented documentation in a way that could reflect on my commission. No dates that matched the actual sequence, no direct evidence attached, just enough language to make an ordinary administrator picture a man with a stamp and a temper. I printed it, because printing turns fear into paper, and paper is easier to handle than adrenaline. I set the page on the kitchen table beside my legal pad and wrote the intake number at the top in clean block letters. Then I wrote the date, then the time, then a single sentence that mattered more than any emotional reaction I could have had. Complaint received after HOA meeting and after late-night porch attempt captured by doorbell. I photographed the page with the clock visible and slid it into a sleeve, because if Brielle wanted to build a record, I was going to make sure the record had structure, not drama. At work, the atmosphere had changed in the way it always changes when a rumor enters the building before you do. People didn't confront me directly, because most adults prefer indirect harm, but I could feel the shift in the pauses, the slightly delayed greetings, the way someone's eyes slid away at the exact moment they should have held. By mid-morning, my supervisor, Carla, sent a short message asking if I could come to her office when I had a moment. She didn't use the word urgent, but the lack of it said more than urgency ever could. Carla's office was small and too tidy, the kind of space meant to convince everyone that order exists if you just label enough things. She offered me a chair and closed the door in the careful way people do when they want privacy, but don't want to look like they're hiding anything. Her face was neutral, but her hands were not. They kept adjusting the same pen on her desk, as if the pen was an anchor. She told me she had received a courtesy notice from the commissioning office, which meant someone had chosen to make sure my workplace felt the pressure early. Carla said there was no action being taken yet, but she needed to document that she had spoken to me because the institution always protects itself first, even when it likes you. I didn't argue with her about fairness. Fairness is a feeling. Procedure is a fact. I told her I understood, and I asked what the notice said, specifically. Carla slid a printed copy across the desk, and I read it without changing my expression, because if you give a room a reaction, the room will use it as its main memory. The notice was bland, but the implication was sharp. A complaint existed, it had been logged, and it might require a response or additional oversight. I told Carla I would respond to the commissioning office in writing and that I had documentation suggesting the complaint was retaliatory. I didn't launch into the story. I didn't say the word kiss. I didn't say Damon's name. I didn't offer my marriage as entertainment. I said retaliatory, because retaliatory is a category administrators understand. And then I asked whether Carla wanted a copy of my written request for allegation specifics. Carla looked relieved at the word written, because written means contained, and contained means less messy for her. She nodded, and I emailed her the short message I had already sent to the office, the one that asked for details and offered context without spilling anything unnecessary. Carla read it, nodded again, and her shoulders lowered slightly, because she could now file me under composed rather than unstable. That classification mattered more than my pride, because Brielle's plan was built on forcing institutions to see me as a problem. If I stayed calm and documented, her allegations would eventually have to stand on their own, and allegations that stand alone often collapse. The conversation ended with a thin layer of reassurance, but I could hear the warning under it. Carla told me to keep things professional, to avoid any misunderstandings, and to remember that optics matter. I thanked her, stood, and left the office without slamming the door, because slamming doors are the kind of detail people repeat. In the hallway, my phone buzzed with a message preview from the shared line, and I didn't need to open it to know what it was. Brielle trying to time her pressure so it landed while I was boxed in by my own workplace. When I got home that evening, the first thing I did was not check my messages, because checking them would have made her feel like she still controlled my pulse. I went to the kitchen, poured water, and sat at the table with my sleeves stacked neatly like a quiet threat. Then I opened the complaint summary again and read it slowly, not as an insult, but as a set of choices she had made. She was escalating. She was willing to involve my livelihood. That meant she believed she was cornered, and cornered people either confess or get reckless. I drafted a clean response to the commissioning office, the kind that wouldn't make anyone roll their eyes. I acknowledged the intake. I requested dates, documents, and the specific conduct being alleged. I stated calmly that an ongoing domestic dispute existed and that I believed the complaint might be retaliatory, based on timed harassment attempts and procedural pressure through a community board. I offered to provide time-stamped evidence if the investigator deemed it relevant. I didn't beg to be believed. I didn't attack my wife. I simply put the possibility of retaliation on the table in professional language, because the key to surviving institutional scrutiny is speaking in the dialect of the institution. After I sent the response, I made myself do something I had been avoiding, because avoidance is how truth turns into rot. I opened the shared cloud album on the family tablet, the one Brielle loved because it made us look like a unit even when we weren't acting like one. I wasn't looking for a gotcha. I was looking for timestamps that could anchor the night of the party, because if Brielle was going to claim anything about my behavior, I wanted my own timeline clean. The album loaded slowly, then filled the screen with cheerful photos that suddenly looked like lies. I scrolled to the party images and tapped through them, noting the timestamps under each one because the cloud doesn't care who is innocent. Most were harmless: cake, candles, friends laughing, my forced smile. Then I found a series from the photo booth ring light area, the same corner where Brielle had insisted on memories, and my throat tightened as I recognized the frames even before I opened them. There were more than the strip I found in her tote bag. There were variations, outtakes, moments before and after, and the metadata under them was clean and unforgiving. I saved the relevant screenshots, each one showing the cloud time and date clearly, and I added them to my evidence folder. Then I noticed something that made the air in the kitchen feel thinner. In the same album, under the recent highlights section, there was a memory card the cloud generated automatically, one of those cheerful compilations that pops up like a surprise party you didn't ask for. The title was something generic, but the thumbnail showed Brielle in a place that was not our home, leaning slightly into someone whose shoulder was just barely visible at the edge of the frame. I tapped it, expecting it to be some old group photo, some innocent overlap of friends. Instead, the memory opened into a short set of images dated 3 weeks before my birthday. Brielle was in the condo mailroom, smiling, and Damon was in the background, not as a casual passerby, but close enough to be part of the moment. The angle was candid, which meant it wasn't staged for me. It was staged for them. The next image showed them at the coffee roaster tour we never went to together, her hand holding a cup, his hand holding the same cup from another angle, their fingers almost touching. The third image was worse, not because it was explicit, but because it was familiar. The same posture as the party, the same closeness, the same comfort. My mind tried to protect me for a second, by offering a softer interpretation, because that's what minds do when they've invested years in a person. Then the metadata finished the job my denial couldn't. The dates were real, the times were real. The images were in a shared space I could access lawfully, in a cloud I owned access to, and they existed without my permission. That meant the kiss at my birthday party wasn't a spontaneous slip. It was a public leak of something that had been happening quietly, and the leak had been intentional because people who hide don't suddenly perform unless they want an outcome. I took screenshots of the memory card view, including the date markers, and I saved them to my evidence folder. I didn't scroll further than I needed to, because my goal wasn't to torture myself. My goal was to anchor the truth to dates. I created a new page in my legal pad, wrote pre-party timeline, and listed the 3-week-old dates with short descriptors: mailroom photo, coffee roaster tour, repeated proximity. I wrote it in plain language and then photographed the page. I felt sick, but it was a clean sickness, the kind that comes from certainty rather than suspicion. That was the second major twist forming, the one that changes what the first betrayal even means. Brielle hadn't kissed Damon and then dismissed it as a drunken mistake because she was careless. She had dismissed it because she had been practicing dismissal for weeks, maybe longer, and she assumed I would accept it the way I accepted everything else. The public kiss wasn't an accident. It was a test, a provocation, a way to see if I would break. When I didn't break, she escalated into systems, because systems don't require you to feel anything. They just require you to comply. My phone buzzed again, and this time I opened the message, not because I was surrendering, but because timing mattered now. Brielle wrote that she was worried about my work complaint, that she didn't want to ruin my life, and that we should handle this privately before things got out of hand. It was a threat wrapped in sympathy, the kind of sentence that makes an outsider think she's compassionate. I read it once, then took a screenshot, because it connected her to the institutional pressure in a way that didn't require me to accuse her. She had acknowledged the complaint existed, and she had tied it to my compliance with her desire for privacy. I did not reply. Instead, I forwarded that screenshot to my personal email and saved it in the folder with the complaint intake. Then I did something else I had been putting off because it felt like admitting the marriage was already dead. I called a family law attorney's office, not to plot revenge, not to punish Brielle, but to ask for the fastest, cleanest route to protect my home and my job within the next 30 days. The attorney's assistant scheduled a consultation for the next afternoon and told me what to bring: basic financial documents, the HOA notice, any written threats, and any evidence of harassment attempts. I thanked them, wrote the appointment time on my legal pad, and photographed it. The act of scheduling felt like stepping onto a moving walkway. Once you're on, you're going somewhere whether you like it or not. That night, I didn't sleep much, but I also didn't spiral. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and replayed those cloud images in my mind, not the kiss itself, but the casual weeks before it, the comfort, the proximity, the way they had been building a private world while I was still buying candles for my birthday like a fool. I felt anger rise once, hot and useless, and I pressed it down, not because I was repressing it, but because I was refusing to let it be my steering wheel. In the morning, I made coffee, opened my evidence folder, and started building a single, neutral, one-page date-place payment table because I could already see where this was going. If Brielle was willing to weaponize institutions, then the only way to stop her was to bring those institutions a cleaner story than hers, one built on dates, places, and documented pressure. The cloud memory dates gave me something I didn't have before, a timeline that proved the betrayal wasn't a one-night slip. It was a pattern that predated the party, which meant her drunk kiss defense wasn't just minimizing. It was deliberately false. I printed the cloud metadata screenshots and placed them behind the page in a sleeve, labeled clearly. I added the screenshot of Brielle's message acknowledging the complaint. I added the doorbell still frame from the late-night porch attempt. Then I sat back and stared at the stack, feeling the weight of it in my chest. Brielle thought she was moving faster than me because she was louder, because she had Paige, because she had Damon, because she could recruit boards and chats and complaint forms like an army. She was wrong. Speed without accuracy is just panic in a suit. When I walked out the door for my attorney consultation, the folder in my hand wasn't a weapon. It was a map, and it pointed to one simple conclusion. Brielle didn't cross a line at my birthday party. She had been living on the other side of it for weeks. The attorney's office smelled like toner and stale coffee, which felt appropriate for the end of a marriage. I laid my folder on the table and watched the assistant's eyes flick to the labels, because labels calm people. The attorney did not care about romance, regret, or whether Brielle ever loved me. He cared about timelines, retaliatory patterns, and how fast a paper trail could become a shield. He told me to stop thinking in terms of winning an argument and start thinking in terms of surviving a 30-day storm. He advised a simple move first, a civil filing that established separation, intent, and boundaries. He explained that retaliatory complaints often crumble when the target responds cleanly and early. He also warned me that Brielle would keep escalating if she believed fear was working. He said the safest strategy was to move the conflict into formal channels she could not charm. I left with an appointment time for a preliminary mediation intake and a list of documents to bring. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat like a quiet passenger. The neighborhood looked unchanged, but it felt different now, because I could see the invisible lines of gossip. When I walked into my house, I didn't feel warmth, only a controlled emptiness. I placed my keys down and opened my legal pad, because routine is the only thing that keeps panic from taking over. I wrote the attorney's instructions in plain words, warning myself not to improvise. I also wrote one sentence that mattered most. All responses must be written, and all meetings must be documented. That night, I prepared a single packet for two purposes, not to punish Brielle, but to protect my credibility. I printed the intake summary, my response requesting specifics, and the cloud metadata screenshots that proved the pattern predated my birthday. I printed the doorbell still frame showing her late-night porch attempt with Damon hovering nearby. I printed the bank transaction line and the receipt copy with its timestamp. Then I made a one-page table that listed dates, places, and documented pressure in simple terms. I kept it neutral, because neutrality is what administrators trust. I slipped everything into sleeves and labeled each one with a date. I took a photo of the stack beside the kitchen clock and saved it, because timing is not paranoia when someone is attacking your livelihood. The next morning, Carla emailed that HR wanted a short meeting, framed as support but scheduled like a warning. 10 minutes later, the commissioning office sent a message assigning an investigator and requesting an in-person review. Both meetings landed on the same day, within 2 hours of each other. The timing was too neat to be coincidence, and the realization made my stomach tighten. Avoiding speculation, I logged the calendar conflict in writing and saved a screenshot of the headers. I then requested, politely, that both meetings confirm agendas in advance. HR replied with a vague reassurance and no agenda. The investigator replied with a single line that said documentation would be reviewed. By late afternoon, Brielle sent another message that pretended to be concern, but carried a soft ultimatum. She said she hoped I would not embarrass her in front of professionals. She said we could still handle things privately if I stopped making it public. She used the word misunderstandings again, like the word could erase timestamps. I saved the message, then I turned off the shared line and placed the phone face down. I wasn't going to negotiate my reputation for peace. On the day of the meetings, I dressed like a man going to court, not flashy, just clean. I carried one folder, nothing else, and I arrived early so nobody could accuse me of rushing in angry. The HR office lobby was full of soft chairs and polite smiles, designed to make conflict feel like therapy. I signed in and waited without fidgeting, watching the door like it was a stage entrance. When it opened, I saw Brielle step inside with her posture straight and her face calm. Damon walked beside her, and behind them came an HR representative holding a blank form. In that moment, I understood they hadn't filed complaints to scare me. They filed them to make sure I was never alone when the record was written. Brielle walked into the HR lobby like she owned the building, and Damon followed like he was the reason she felt safe doing it. Carla was already there, standing near the sign-in counter with that tight smile managers use when they want to look human while protecting the company first, and the HR representative beside her held a blank form like it was a shield. I stayed seated, because standing up too fast is how men get labeled dangerous, and Brielle had spent a week trying to staple that label to my forehead. The HR representative introduced herself, then gestured toward a conference room, and we filed in with the quiet choreography of people pretending this was normal. Brielle sat across from me. Damon angled himself beside her like a bodyguard, and I noticed the way he avoided looking at my hands, as if he expected them to do something stupid. I didn't give him that comfort. I placed my folder on the table and kept my palms open because I wanted every witness to remember one thing: I came prepared, not enraged. The HR representative began with policy language about professional conduct and workplace safety, and Brielle nodded at the right moments like she was in control of the script. Damon tried to add weight with a calm voice, describing my unpredictable behavior after the party, and I almost admired the audacity. He wasn't just denying the kiss mattered. He was trying to turn my silence into evidence of instability, because silence scares men like him when it doesn't come with submission. I waited until they finished, then I asked one simple question in a flat tone. Was this meeting about my conduct, or about retaliation tied to an affair that had already become a community record? Brielle's eyes flicked to Carla, then to the HR representative, then back to me, because she understood the danger of that word retaliation in a professional room. The HR representative asked what documentation I had, and I slid a single sleeve across the table. Not a pile, just one clean packet with a one-page timeline on top. Carla read the first line, then the second, and her face changed without permission. The HR representative checked the attachments in order, reading dates and times out loud like she was verifying inventory, and each number landed like a quiet hammer. The photo booth strip showed the kiss at my birthday party with the venue date stamp. The cloud album metadata screenshots showed Damon with Brielle weeks before that night in public spaces we both had access to, with clean timestamps that didn't care how charming she looked today. The merchant alert and receipt copy showed a late-night purchase tied to my account after the party, with the POS time printed plainly. The doorbell still frame showed Brielle on my porch after midnight with Paige, while Damon hovered near the walkway like a coward trying to stay off camera. Finally, I placed the screenshot of Brielle's message on top, the one where she referenced my work complaint while urging me to handle it privately, and the HR representative's eyes paused on that line longer than the rest. Damon shifted in his seat and tried to speak, but the HR representative held up a hand, procedural and cold. Brielle attempted the usual pivot, calling it personal, calling it messy, calling it unfair to bring here, and Carla's expression went hard because managers hate liability more than they hate conflict. The HR representative asked Brielle directly whether she had filed or coordinated any complaint intended to pressure my employment, and Brielle's answer came out too fast, too defensive, and not clean enough to be true. The HR representative turned to Carla and said she was opening a formal case, then read the case ID aloud and typed it into the record while we watched. She cited policy language about retaliation and misuse of company channels, and she instructed Damon to leave the room immediately pending review. Damon tried to protest, but security appeared at the door like they had been waiting for a signal, and the moment his badge was requested, his confidence cracked. Brielle stared at him like he had failed her, then looked back at me with a kind of rage that had no place left to hide. I didn't gloat, and I didn't argue. I slid one final page across the table, a stamped civil filing receipt from my separation intake, because I wanted the room to understand this was no longer a debate. The HR representative glanced at it, nodded once,